Welcome back. You're still watching Newsfeed PM. For some reaction, we are joined by political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng, who will be talking to us about the briefing that the former President Jacob Zuma conducted earlier this afternoon. And now Asanda Ngoasheng is a political analyst. Asanda, thank you for joining us this evening. Now, among many other factors raised by former President Jacob Zuma, he said that he was arrested for daring to challenge what he's described as commercial interests with the intention to profit from poor people. What was your take on the briefing this afternoon?
I thought it was very interesting how Jacob Zuma spoke as if he is a man who is a victim and he is a man with no power and who has never had any power. I mean, if you think about the fact that the man has been the deputy president of the country since about 1999, to hear him speak, you would think that he had no hand in how South Africa became what it is today and many of the problems that exist, particularly, the ones that you mentioned, ESCOM and SAA, who we know from the State Capture Commission actually fell down or became what they are now because of Gupta-linked companies that were literally taking money out of those organizations by the bucket loads by the day.
So do you believe that the timing of this is perfectly placed to pave the way for the former president come the ANC elective conference in December?
Yes, it's definitely about the elective conference. That's why his first salvo was to the sitting president, Cyril Ramaphosa, criticizing him on the Pala scandal and saying that if it had been him that had been found with money in, a property that was linked to him, that there would have been an uproar, and claiming that there hadn't been an uproar, which is a lie because there has been uproar. Civil society groups have called for accountability from Cyril Ramaphosa, but he paints a picture that seems as if there hasn't been any uproar. And I think that, I'm at a point where I keep asking myself, why are we still paying Jacob Zuma presidential benefits? Because the reason we pay presidential benefits generally in terms of the global practice is because you do not want to find yourself with a former president who gets, who runs out of money and then starts sabotaging the country or selling some of the trade secrets that they have. And I think that Jacob Zuma has proven to us on more than one occasion that he can be bought and that he is willing to divulge, state secrets at any and every point, and at every single briefing that he has, he hints at these things. And we know also from the July riots, which his own daughter was on Twitter encouraging, that not only was the looting of shops, but also there were wide-scale attacks on national key points like Transnet, like the ports, and various other areas which require information of a person who has been in a position like the presidency. And so I think that we really need to quit playing around and treating Jacob Zuma like he's just this irritation that's going to go away. And we need to actually persecute him, and we need to remove those benefits because he is not showing or doing what it is that we are paying him to ensure that he does. And most frankly for me is the fact that he has cast aspersions on our judiciary and is making claims that our very constitutional court is questionable, and that the person who is the Chief Justice at the moment is a questionable character. Now, if any other person was making these allegations, we could have debates, very interesting debates about it, and I've said some things about the Constitution myself, but this is the former president, and as a former president, when he says something, we don't have a choice but to listen to him. And not only do we not have a choice but to listen to him, but investors also listen to him, and others who have a vested interest in South Africa do listen to him. And I think it's quite reckless that he is allowed to continue to have these press briefings, to continue to cast aspersions on the sitting president, but also to continue to cast aspersions on our judiciary, and to completely disregard the separation of powers that are enshrined in this democratic South Africa. And I really don't understand how it is that the ANC, as the governing party, continues to allow Jacob Zuma to be the loose cannon that he is, because he's not only dangerous for the ANC, but he's quite frankly dangerous for South Africa in terms of the kind of influence that he wields purely as a former president.
You made mention of state secrets that the former president could possibly put out. From his briefing today, what state secrets would you say he hinted to in his briefing?
Well, it's not necessarily that he hinted, state secrets in this particular case. But what I'm saying is, if we look at July, we know that there was clear and plain economic sabotage. We know that ports were targeted. We know that various other national key points have been targeted ever since he was in jail or trying to get out of jail. And we know that, some of the things that have happened can only be possible if the people who have had access to the highest knowledge about South Africa's state security were actually involved. And we know from seeing on Twitter that his daughter was the one who was, encouraging people to continue with the looting, to continue to destabilize the country. That is exactly what we pay a president to not do, to not be involved in the destabilization of the country, because by virtue of being a former president, you have access to information that can make it very easy for you to destabilize the country. And it's quite irresponsible, as I said, that Jacob Zuma continues to be allowed to, cast aspersions on these democratic institutions like the judiciary, like the executive, etc., etc., and there don't seem to be any repercussions for that. And I think it's high time that South Africans started calling for a cancellation of his presidential benefits, because he's not acting in the manner in which we are paying to ensure that he does.
Now, going back to this being perfectly placed and timed for the ANC elective conference in December, we do know that the former president was released on parole because he was terminally ill. But today he declared that he's well and fit to stand for office. So what would an ordinary citizen make of such?
Well, I think it just proves the fact that what we all suspected, which is that Jacob Zuma was never really sick, or never as sick as his doctors claim that he was. And it was all a ruse for him to get out of jail. Literally, he just wanted a get out of jail card, and he got it. And I think, it's going to be interesting should the question of whether he should have been released on parole or not come up again in court. And it's going to be interesting to see if he will even have time to be able to, to do the kind of electioneering he's going to need to do to be anywhere by 2024, because he has a flurry of cases surrounding corruption and various other, charges that he needs to be going to court for. And so I don't even know if he's going to have the time that he thinks he's going to have of going around and garnering support for himself for December, but also for, post-December. And this is the question that we currently have with a lot of ANC people, that, you may win the seat in December this year, but will you make it to 2024? Because we know that there are a flurry of names, a long, long list of names, including some NEC members who have been accused of corruption in state capture. And, I find it quite fascinating. Jacob Zuma spent quite a lot of time dealing with state capture and dealing with Judge Zondo in particular. Some of the things that he said, which I found quite fascinating, is that, number one, that the commission itself was unlawfully constituted, but he was the one who actually constituted it. And he was the one that actually chose Zondo out of the various names that were possible. And he also keeps alluding, for example, to this relationship that he and Zondo has, which Zondo has denied. He keeps saying Zondo is my friend, Zondo is my relative, and Zondo has plain out said on more than one occasion that they are not friends. And of course, knowing a person and having had, conversation or engagement with a person does not make them your friend. And I think, it's very interesting how Zuma continued to paint himself as a victim, as a person who is without power, as a plain man. At some stage when he was being asked about some of the things he said about ESCOM, he suddenly turned around and said, well, I'm not an engineer, which harks back to, his favorite phrase during his almost 10 years of power, where he would say he's just a boy from Kandla. And I think, for me, what's really sad is that he must really undermine, and he must really not think much of the intelligence of South Africans to spew some of the stuff that he was spewing and to obfuscate in the manner that he was, because he was conflating things that have nothing to do with each other. He was obfuscating, and he was literally just throwing everything that he had in the bag. And quite, what's sad for me is that we've seen this play before. We've seen, just before his battle off with Thabo Mbeki, he did the very same thing, painted himself as a victim, kind of obfuscated facts, and made himself to be the haunted, the hunted, and the targeted, and pretended as if he, is innocent. And I was very glad, for example, when during the press briefing, there was a question from a journalist about, what do you actually take accountability for? Are you responsible for anything? And he couldn't answer that. And you could see in his face that he hadn't been prepared for that question. And him and his team were quite visibly irritated when the journalist actually kept pressing on with that question. Because I think somehow they assumed that everybody was just going to lap up his stories, and I think, there's this kind of, there's this thing in South Africa where people think because they fought in the struggle, because they somehow were involved in South Africa and were, part of the group of people who we thought were good, who were trying to get us out of oppression, somehow they have a blank check to do the most evil things, the most cruel things, because Jacob Zuma's tenure, almost 10 years of it, and more if you think about the fact that he was the deputy president before, he has led to the worst of South Africa. And we are still suffering from the after effects of his non-leadership. And we are still suffering from the after effects of state capture and rampant corruption and rampant poverty and hunger, which him and the Guptas and all of his cronies and family members ensured happened in a South Africa that was otherwise thriving. So if you think back to, just before Jacob Zuma, took the reins, South Africa was a good place to be. The middle class was firmly placed and was able to afford their lives. And we are now sitting in a South Africa where nobody has any security, whether you're talking about crime or you're talking about the economy, in part because of COVID, in part because, Cyril Ramaphosa was also a letdown, but in the main because Jacob Zuma laid the foundation for a weak state. And he ensured that all the Chapter 9 institutions that had the power and possibility to hold him and his cronies accountable were weakened. And we are still trying to recover from that. And so for him to try to, raise or rear his head again after that devastation and destruction, never mind July 2021, that we are still trying to recover from as well. And people in KZN will tell you, between July and the looting and, the flooding that has happened, the economy of KZN is literally on its knees. And many people are actually emigrating out of KZN in what we're seeing with a lot of provinces, people running away, but particularly KZN, people are moving away from it because they're seeing it as a province where anything can happen anytime. And this is in part because of Jacob Zuma and his politics, where he is either the king or the kingmaker, or nobody else is going to have peace.
But Asanda, can we purely squarely put the blame only on Jacob Zuma's time? Because, you just make mention of the time before that he was president. We know that we had the highest growth rate in terms of our GDP of 4.1% during that time, but unemployment was also shooting through the roof at the time. We also know that Eskom had poor planning with regards to where we currently are with the parastatal, and because of the poor planning during Thabo Mbeki's time, we are sitting with the amount of load shedding that we're sitting with. So can we squarely put all the blame of what we are facing today on what had happened during Jacob Zuma's tenure?
We can put the blame on the ANC, the African National Congress, and its lack of leadership in general, and its generally corrupt relationship with the state, and its generally corrupt relationship with leadership and its patronage lines, we can put the blame squarely on them. But what Jacob Zuma does and what he represents is almost a decade of degradation. While, for example, in the Thabo Mbeki tenure, there's a lot that you can critique, but there's also a lot that was going right. Now, Jacob Zuma came and just drove us very fast to a very deep and a dark place that we are still trying to pull ourselves out of. And so if the situation was bad when Thabo Mbeki left, Jacob Zuma ensured that we ended up at the worst of the worst, and we are still trying to, walk our way back from that. And we may never be able to walk our way back from that, by the way. And I think for me, what is infuriating as a South African is the idea that somebody can be responsible, both as an individual who was in power, and secondly, as an individual who held a position of power within the governing party, which has been in power for almost 30 years in South Africa, and still come out pretending like he had no hand in where we are. It's quite unacceptable. And it's actually, as I said, he really undermines or underestimates the intelligence of South Africans, and he refuses to be held responsible for anything. He actually comes across as quite a narcissist of a person who, when anything goes wrong, he blames anybody and everybody and actually takes zero responsibility for himself and for his actions. And in fact, we often talk a lot about Jacob Zuma and the destruction that he caused to the economy, in terms of corruption and in terms of state institutions. But one of the things that Jacob Zuma quite squarely can be held responsible as well is the death of HIV programs and what was then called the Moral Regeneration Program. This is the same person, who, while he was leading the Moral Regeneration Project, went and slept with an HIV positive woman and said you can shower in order to get rid of HIV at a time when we were trying to give the youth the correct message. And as if that was not enough, he then went on to have a relationship with a young girl whose very sole role in the Department of Health was to be an ambassador against sugar daddies. And he became the ultimate sugar daddy, went on to marry this young girl, or pretend he was going to marry her and engage her, and she had his baby and was never even married. So the kind of moral fiber of the country and the kind of values that we as a country espoused pre-Jacob Zuma and post-Jacob Zuma are very much clearly different. And he has to take some responsibility for that. And the longer we say, oh, it can't just be Jacob Zuma, it has to be also these people and these people, the more we are helping him to run away from responsibility. And until he can at least come out and be able to state which pieces of this mess can he say were his doing, I have no respect whatsoever for him.
Now, he also went on to slam the current president. I mean, he raised the issue of Phala and stated that his interest in business is unconstitutional. And he further touched on his government doing away with load shedding. However, under the CR leadership, SAA is gone, which is a fact, and Eskom seems to be well on its way. Is he warranted to make these remarks?
It is completely unwarranted, particularly coming from him, for the one reason that the very Brian Molefe that he's saying during Brian Molefe's time there was no load shedding, during Brian Molefe's time things were going well, is the same one who has had to have a court tell him to pay back 30 million and then another 9 million in pension funds and benefits. This is not somebody who has walked away with a clean slate. This is somebody who was very much corrupt. And even though he hasn't necessarily been charged in court and been found guilty of specific levels of corruption, it's very clear that in how his package was negotiated and his receiving of that package, it was unconstitutional, it was corrupt. And this is why he has paid back the money, because he himself, you don't pay back money you don't think you owe. You pay back money when you admit that there is guilt, that there is some truth to the fact that you should never have had that 30 million in the first place. And now and now Eskom is busy trying to get yet another 9 million out of him, which he got when he wasn't supposed to get. And so I can't entertain any conversations on Eskom and and Jacob Zuma's tenure that paints Brian Molefe as a hero, when we can see quite clearly that he was the opposite of a hero. And more than that, we know from state capture that it was the Gupta-related companies that really were the straw that broke the camel's back when it came to Eskom and when it came to corruption. And if anything, I would say that what they were doing in those 3 years may have been some semblance of putting together what needed to be put together to make it seem like there isn't going to be any load shedding, but they ensured that we are going to be perpetually stuck in this very situation that we are in through stealing billions, not millions, billions of rands that we are yet to recover. There's a reason why even the state of Dubai saw fit to agree with South Africa that they needed to be arrested and that they needed to be held. If there was no case to answer for, the state of Dubai would not have given South Africa that extradition, and they would not be in jail in Dubai right now as we speak. And I think that, this is what I mean when I say Jacob Zuma undermines the intelligence of South Africans, and he really doesn't think much of us as citizens. Because if he did, he wouldn't state such blatant untruths and lies in the face of stated facts and things that can very easily be refuted. And I think, this is classic Jacob Zuma. Refute, deny, obfuscate, obscure. That's what he does. He takes 10 different stories and weaves them together into a tale that connects things that are not connected, or connects things in ways that are not connected and pretends them to be something else. And I think it's time that we started responding to him and telling him that he is a liar,
right,
and has been lying, and we cannot pretend like we don't see that.
All right. Thank you for that analysis. That was political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng unpacking for us the Zuma media briefing that happened earlier today.